Well, this is exciting.
All right, now about to introduce you. Hold the fort. All right, go sit down, Phil. I'm ready to go. Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, and we're going to go to Woburn, Massachusetts, and we're going to go to Washington, D.C. today. And we're going to talk about biodiversity. I have two fellows here who are very concerned about the loss of biodiversity in this world, and they're going to tell us what we need to do. One of them is Jim Laurie, who's in Woburn, Massachusetts. He is a biologist, and I've been looking at some of his previous YouTube shows, and we're really going to be, he's got some slides with him, so watch out for those slides. Okay, in Washington, D.C. is Philip Bogdanov. And Phil, I knew a little bit when he was focusing more on peace than he was on the biodiversity, so we're sort of longtime acquaintances. Hi, Phil, how are you? Okay, so both of you guys are involved in some way with an outfit called Biodiversity for a Livable Planet. Is that the title? In the organization?
Yeah, we can't hear you, Phil. It's
Okay,
biodiversity.
You're muted.
Biodiversity for a livable climate.
Climate, good. All right. Well, why don't you start us off and tell us why the biodiversity has anything what to do with the climate?
So I'm actually going to do something a little bit different, not wholly related to biodiversity as a start. I want to kind of give certainly my motivation for focusing on biodiversity in nature, which is that I think, our human predicament is becoming very dire, and some of the solutions that we may be hoping for might not come to fruition. But I think nature's been there for many billions of years, and we need to learn how to work with her. So what I want to do is just kind of show a few slides.
Okay.
To set the stage for him. So our human predicament. And the first slide I have here, if I can get it to move, I want to talk about our energy predicament. Global warming, I think most of us and your viewers understand increasingly through the media what's happening. But the main part of our talk, or Jim's talk, I think, is going to be focusing on the power of biology and what we might be able to do working with nature to sequester CO2 and restore habitat, and our role as humans. So the main issue that I think I want to raise and make people aware of is that our hopes for solar and wind as being solutions for transforming our economy, replacing fossil fuels, are, I think, very idealistic, perhaps even to the point of fantasy, certainly in the next few decades. This is the sort of picture of what the U.S. energy consumption is, and you can see solar in yellow and wind in purple. And if you add up those numbers and put them over the total of 92.9 quadrillion BTUs, I've done the calculation in the lower right corner, they only make up about 3.5% of our energy mix. More than half, about 85% of our economy is dependent upon fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. In Maryland, where I live, it's even worse. The ratio is, a little less than 1.4%. I found this picture for Canada. It's a little bit dated, but I don't think it's changed very much. The wind in purple, solar in yellow again, and doing the calculation, it's less than 0.2% of Canada's energy comes from renewables, at least solar and wind. So the issue is, how can we transform? This is a global picture on the left in 2018, and this is a team out of Norway that involved 15 other countries in some modeling exercises to try to figure out how could we get to 2050 and grow solar and wind and other renewables as much as possible. So even after,
Sorry, but the thing on the right is the good thing, and the thing on the left is a bad thing, and we're trying to get from here to there, right?
correct, the thing on the left is current, and 2050 on the right is where we'd like to go. So they used very aggressive assumptions to see how rapidly could we scale up solar and wind, solar in yellow and wind in light blue on the left column there. So even after 30 years, still about half of our energy is coming from oil in red, natural gas in the grayish brown, and coal in the darker gray. So we are going to be wedded to fossil fuels for a considerable period of time, meaning that we're going to be emitting CO2. So yes, we need to do this, but we also need to look at ways of drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is a recent book published in March that sort of examines piece by piece, solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, all the various options to look at what is realistically feasible, what are the environmental costs for some of these things, and I highly recommend it. So here we are on planet Earth in this predicament with energy transition upon us, climate getting worse and worse. How do we solve this? This is a recent snapshot from the Mauna Loa Observatory called the Keeling Curve, which shows the kind of incremental addition of CO2 in the atmosphere. And you'll notice the wiggles represent seasonal variation. If we expand one of those wiggles to, this is a 2-year snapshot, we can see and look at the scale on the left. Say we pick the low point on the right of about 410 parts per million, and we see it go up to, at its peak, maybe 417, 418. So that's an increase of 7 parts per million, and the equivalent. So that's during the oxidation phase of when plants are senescing in the fall and winter, and the CO2 is being emitted. But in the next season, that amount of stuff is being drawn down by growing nature, by the green plants. So it's on the order of 7, 8 parts per million per year. And if you stop to think about it, on our planet, we have a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere. When the northern hemisphere is growing, the southern hemisphere is in its fall and winter phase. And so we actually have the two hemispheres working against each other. Some is growing and some is emitting CO2. If we were able to adjust that, the magnitude on the planet, if we were to get the seasons to align on the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, is probably on the order of 10 or 12 parts per million per year that nature extracts from the atmosphere and puts into green material, woody material, organic matter in the soil. So it's this technology, which was invented 3.5 billion years ago, that is the workhorse for what Jim is going to be talking about in terms of what we can do to help work with nature to sequester carbon. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Jim.
Okay.
Thanks.
So
Let's say hello to Jim first. Everybody needs to see your face.
Okay, yeah. I've got, I always have a hard time figuring out which, I have a lot of screens on the, let's see. How do I choose? There you go. So you ought to see a beaver up there on the screen. Is it, you see that up in the corner?
Well, I'm not sure. Is that the black thing that's drinking water?
Okay, we'll go. So you got the slide, so that's good. Let me see where I want to start.
Seriously, is that black thing the beaver?
That's a beaver, yeah. That's,
Okay.
and you'll see him again. So we'll come back. I'll just give a little background. I am a biologist, but my master's degree is in future studies. And that was down at, I got my degrees in Houston. I went to Rice and went to University of Houston. So I just put that up there so people, that'll be on your recording. And I'm a systems thinker. I try to teach people how to think in systems. And Dana Meadows was probably our best teacher of systems thinking, and she died too early here a decade or so ago.
Mhm.
But can you see my cursor down there?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so that's good. Dana had like 12 ways to intervene in a system, and she said numbers were not worth the time put into them a lot of the time. And that was number 12 out of the 12 ways. And I started looking at, well, what are the 4 most important ways? And John Todd, who's part of New Alchemy Institute in Massachusetts years ago, he and his wife started New Alchemy Institute. He taught me about self-organizing systems. And Alan Savory taught me about making goals. And he's the guy that taught me about grazing when I lived in Texas. And Lynn Margulis was absolutely essential in this because she turned evolution upside down and said it's about the microbes. If you get the microbes right, if you keep them happy, you have a chance. And then, but then Dana Meadows comes back and says, being in the paradigm mode isn't enough. You have to go back and question your own paradigms. You can't just teach what you think's happening. You have to go back and constantly see what's changing. So that's my first slide. Philip had a lot of concern about it. We're getting warmer. And this is a complicated slide, but if we go back 60 million years, the Paleocene, the Eocene, the Oligocene, but this is where we are now. We've gone through an ice age period. This is the temperature, okay, considered now, but we're starting to go up. But for the last 20,000 years or 100,000 years or so, we've been very cold. So we've been several degrees below.
Wait a minute, what's this green thing?
That's the temperature. That's the variation in the temperature. And you see it's really squiggling a lot because of ice ages. But if we go back 50 million years, the planet was much, much warmer. And it was like 10 or 12 degrees centigrade warmer.
And the second half of the graph is the ice ages, but this jiggling up and down means there's a new ice age for each.
Well, there were probably a dozen ice ages, and then and so we humans evolved during the ice ages. And it's interesting that for 8 million years the CO2 levels never rose above 300. For 8 million years, that's the entire human time on the planet. So we're in something now that we're not very well adapted for. But I looked at this chart and saw this, and I thought, how in the world did the planet cool so much in the last 50 million years? And there was one big downstroke here in the Eocene, and there was another one in the Miocene. And so we're gonna kind of look. This is a Zola, which is kind of a miracle plant that we think probably built the permafrost in Siberia and in Canada.
Really?
The Arctic Ocean used to be almost fresh water. It was much smaller as the continents moved apart. I'm growing a Zola in the backyard, and it gets very, very thick very fast. And it's incredibly nutritious. It's a water fern. It's not really algae. It's a water fern. And this is this came out of India. They're trying to figure out how do we start growing a Zola again, and trying to keep the permafrost going. That might be a clue. It's something.
Oh, really? Now, how so? What does it do that's different from other plants?
It just grows so fast, and imagine 20 feet of permafrost that maybe that started. So that's just an example, but there's many more, and you mentioned here a minute ago the megafauna.
Yeah.
And we've got a guy up in Siberia at Pleistocene, trying to start Pleistocene Park. He's bringing in buffalo, he's bringing in muskox, and the sea moths.
Yeah.
And so this came out. This was in National Geographic. The idea that big animals used to they migrate a lot, and they bring a lot of nutrition to wherever they go. They migrate in herds, they poop all over the place. And the idea is, how do we get this carbon into the ground? And a lot of parts of the earth are what Alan Savory called brittle environments, that they have dry seasons, and the microbes have a hard time in the dry seasons. So using the Lynn Margulis thoughts, how do we keep our microbes happy? It's good to have a lot of poop. So here, Scientific American says we have a poop paucity predicament.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the idea. So,
well, now wait a minute, because that's just the opposite of what I've been reading. That I've been reading Drawdown yesterday,
yeah.
and it said a certain amount of the methane that is coming up is coming out of poop that's left on the ground. So now, if we increase the amount of poop, that's a problem.
Well,
why do you think there's a shortage of poop?
I'm going to suggest that that's all mistaken, and the idea that in a healthy system, that poop gets buried by dung beetles almost anywhere in the world, and that's pretty much a human. Humans have, largely killed off the dung beetles, but those could come back. But the other side of it is, I think that the fear of methane coming out of the Arctic is much bigger. This is a much bigger issue.
I agree. Yeah, I'm worried every night of the week about that.
So now look at this CO2 levels. This is 18,000 years ago they were down to 180. They were down to 240. 12,000, and then it got warmer. And maybe that's colder than we want to go. But this is where we are now. I took this in West Texas. Well, actually, I wasn't far from Dallas, and you see areas like this all the time where things are just drying out.
Mm-hmm.
So let me introduce John Todd and New Alchemy. And there was a huge, this is on Cape Cod, and this is a septage lagoon. And Cape Cod lives on freshwater, very, very small freshwater lens. That's their water. And this is a cranberry bog waste, and it was also septage they were pumping into this reservoir here, and it was polluting the ponds in the area. And John kind of had this intuition that if I pay attention to the microbes, I can clean the water. And he just thought, well, let's put in all the biodiversity we can into these tanks. You see the size of them. There may be 500 gallons per tank.
What is in those tanks?
Well, he just decided to put everything in and let it self-organize and see what happened. And this
One tank will hold what? And the other tank will hold what? Some of them.
Oh, no. These are all connected. So
oh.
you're pumping this stuff out, and you notice on this end, it's much darker.
Oh, yeah.
By the time it gets on this end.
Oh, I see. And then you put it in the pond or what?
Well, yeah, he was just recirculating it. And what we found is that the pond got cleaner and cleaner over the sludge on the bottom of this started to disappear. And this, within a year, these things. But just imagine all these connected, and then look at it.
Oh, I see. This is water stuff in there. I see. I thought these were painted or metal containers, but these are
fiberglass. These are fiberglass.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And it's got all of the gunk, and you're moving it from one tube to another down the line. Is that it?
Well, they filled these with water to start with, and algae started growing in them, and they thought, well, maybe we can get more photosynthesis if we have sunlight coming in from all directions. It's like lifting the river out of the ground. So you get more dimensions. And then this is what it looked like a few months later.
Oh, yeah, it looks prettier anyway. I don't know.
And Lynn Margulis showed up, and she saw like this red stuff. This is oxygen. These are microbes that get energy from the oxidation of iron. And so you're kind of like, she said, well, we're going back in evolution by looking at this stuff. And John said, well, if you turn around and go the other direction, you're going forward in evolution. You get more biodiverse. And the water that came out of it, this is the water hyacinths blooming. They had some marsh systems here with cattails and bulrushes. But the picture that got me, because I was working at a chemical plant at the time, was this picture. The water that came out of the system.
Beautiful.
After 3 or 4 days. And I thought, can I do this at the chemical plant?
Could you drink that water?
I would swim in it. You know, drinking is maybe harder, but you know, I wouldn't feel bad. This would be swimmable water for sure, high
right.
quality water,
Uh,
and I wouldn't be too concerned if I drank some of it. Yeah, but this was chemical wastewater from a, you know, we had some very nasty stuff, chlorinated solvents, gasoline kind of things, and this came out of the labs, and we thought, well, what can we pre-treat stuff before we send it down to the environmental. And again, you see this reddish iron bacteria in the first tank, and each tank got better and better and better. And after
Right, now
about,
this one on the top right is a close up of some of the contents of what
yeah,
you see there in the left one.
that's the first tank, and you see the oxygen bubbles here. This is
Okay.
algae growing like, this is in Texas, so got very warm. There's these the water became very rich in oxygen. It was quite remarkable.
Now,
And,
those are little bubbles attached to the wall of the tank.
yeah, yeah, they're trying to get out from the algae. The snails would come down here and try to eat the algae, and they'd stay in the bubbles sometimes because they were in a, you know, this was an anaerobic tank, you know, in general, because the water coming out of this little, you see up here, we had a marsh system upstream, and the water coming out of that could have a lot of sulfur in it and stuff. So, but the snails, you know, they're living on the edge here. This is Placostomus, you know, this is a armored catfish. This turned sideways, you know, so the picture would fit. Kind of put your head around, but they would just graze on the side of these lighter tanks, and you see some goldfish. We had reproducing fish in these systems, and everybody said, "How is the water getting so clean?" Because the water, you know, I'll show you some results. Ammonia is pretty tough to clean. The water that we sent out into Galveston Bay had 20 parts per million sometimes of ammonia, and you know, we were able to get it in this little system down to 1. We could get chloroform down to parts per billion, almost hard to even notice. That's the cleanest water in terms of chloroform we ever saw. And then we had BPA was part of our processes. We made polycarbonate, and that's really hard to break down, and we were able to see that disappear.
Is that the stuff that's in plastics that they say are turning us, well, males anyway, infertile?
Yeah, that was the thing, because they were using it in baby bottles, and when you heat the baby bottles, the BPA can unzip out of the polymer. So
Yeah.
that's
And,
right.
and the males are lower sperm count nowadays. Is that right? Because of
well, that might very well be true. So that's,
well, I mean, I that's what I'm wondering. Are we talking about this BPA? Is what we're talking about?
yeah, that was
Yeah.
Theo Colburn did a lot of work on the Great Lakes, and it affected fish, it affected animals, it affected humans too. So
Okay.
so
Now, let me make sure I understand what you're doing. You put any number of god-awful combinations of things together, and somehow, if you put enough of the right microbes in there, they're going to take care, they're all going to clean the thing up. I mean, this is a kind of a theory or something I don't know what to make of. How do you know what you're doing?
this is what's real interesting. I spent years trying to figure out what the species were and all that kind of stuff. And I spent 4 years talking to John saying, you know, which species works better on which chemical and that kind of thing. And John was insisting, no, this is a self-organizing process. The more species you put into the system, you know, some things will not do well and other things will do well. But the fact that you've got to, so he said, go get mud from the healthy streams, go get mud from the polluted streams, go down to the sewage plant, go to the chemical wastewater, you know, plant, and get all those different organisms in there. This was the Margulis approach to it. Now, it was interesting when John did these experiments, the Margulis students from UMass Amherst came out and looked at it, and they said, wow, we know the species, but we don't know the ecosystems. This is something new. And this,
Well, are you saying that maybe each of these tanks has its own ecosystem? You move the water from one tank to the next. They're going down the line, right?
Yep.
And everything that's in it goes to the next. I don't know. And
well,
how do you,
it's communicating with the next tank? It's microbes that are in one tank are going to the next tank.
oh, they can move on their own. Are these
Yeah.
tanks connected?
Yes, yes,
It's like one long tank.
yeah, and
Oh, okay. So
And
at one end, okay, so the water just moves
Yeah.
it by itself from one end to the other, bringing all whatever junk it wants to as it moves.
so the microbes can move pretty freely. Now, if you've got something really toxic in there, what he did is he put at the far end in tank number 20, he had fish in there, and he's quite a monitor of fish. He studied ponds for a long time, and he said, well, that's kind of the quality control. If the fish aren't acting right, then we might have a problem, and we'll slow down the flow. But what happened was that the fish started migrating upstream, and
So how do you slow the flow?
well,
I guess I'm not understanding what this machine is, or this whole system is. These are separate tanks, and you move them from one to the other, or are they connected and the water can flow from one end to the next?
You pipe out of this really, nasty reservoir. You go into this tank, and they go, and the overflow goes into the next tank, and so forth. Okay.
The overflow.
Yeah. So
you take an overflow whenever it gets to a certain stage, you move it to the next tank.
There's pipes connecting them. So so this will go in, and they'll have water coming in, and so the nasty stuff's going in one side.
Yeah.
And then we're going through, and as you notice that this is after a few weeks of doing this. It's very dark on this end, but it's getting lighter as we go across.
Now down at this left end, you've got the fish.
And the fish, and what they noticed is that the fish would, the pipes were like 2-inch pipes, so they could move upstream if they were finding little fish going upstream. So they weren't too concerned. And the other thing is, over time, they could increase the flow. The system was learning how to get all the nutrients out of that water. He stopped talking about a waste stream and started talking about a nutrient stream.
Oh my goodness!
So this was done in the late 1980s, and I did this project in 1990, early 1990s, and I knew I had some really toxic stuff. And what we found was that we had 4 different labs studying this water, and the water coming out was really high quality. So that's the idea that I became a believer that anybody could clean water. Anybody could clean water by getting enough biodiversity into their system.
So Meta, basically, the tanks are the mechanical means of moving water from one tank to another, but you populate the tanks with as much biodiversity as you can, taking soil samples, water samples, et cetera, and just dumping it in. The system self-organizes. It figures out which kind of initially anaerobic bacteria are needed to break down XYZ, and then the products of that flow into the next tank, and maybe it's a slightly different ecosystem that is more tolerant of the poisons, but it knows how to break down a bit more, and so on and so on. And gradually, as Jim hinted, you kind of recapitulate evolution from the single cell to the higher forms of animals and water invertebrates, and then the plants floating on top that have figured out how to survive in each of the ecosystems. And the fact that
ordinary people could, if I had a whole bunch of plastic containers, could I do a thing like this? Or
I've got one in the backyard right now. The homeschool students build these things all the time, and we experiments with them. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, do you start off by filling them all with water, and you just put the nasty stuff up at one end, and you hope that it'll straighten itself out later?
You can start piping in at any kind of flow rate you want. We play around with food waste because we don't want toxic stuff in school. But if you've got stuff left over from food waste and stuff, that's usually
okay. But now, wait a minute, you got your waste up at one end. Do you fill all the other tanks with plain water and then watch to see what happens?
Well, I usually start with rainwater.
But you fill them. You fill all the tanks originally. All right. See, I'm having a hard time understanding how the whole thing works.
Well, we can do, yeah.
Okay, got it. I think, I'm getting it. I'm not sure what I've got.
It took me 4 years to start doing it. And
All right.
I was still trying to figure it out. And then I realized that no, what John was teaching me is you, the nature is the intelligence here. It's not the human. The human is putting these things together and becoming a catalyst, but it's not the.
Well, now you just put in biological stuff, right? You don't you don't go out and get cans of paint or, kerosene or chemicals. What you put in is biological critters.
In this system, we started this system on the waste pad at the chemical lab in Texas, and we had stuff coming out of the lab that included gasoline, chlorinated solvents. We had a lot of high nitrogen compounds, and all of those things broke down by the time they reached these fish tanks here. Those things all broke down in the system.
So you can put just any old chemical, any old.
Well, you can try. You don't want to. You want to figure out what kind of flow rate they can stand. But the idea is, if you've got a pond that's polluted, and you start recirculating stuff through a healthy system, like maybe you've got a system on the side of your pond or whatever, like what John did, and you can start cleaning that pond and start restoring the biodiversity. So.
Okay, so now the outcome is you got that pond, that first picture you showed us of a pond.
Yeah.
That pond is now clean or not?
Well, actually, what they were worried about, this lagoon isn't there anymore. They've taken the waste, they've built a better wastewater treatment plant, so they don't dump all that stuff together. But right next to it is a pond called Flax Pond that had about 2 feet of sludge in it because of the overflow from this septage lagoon. And in about a year, what they did is John built a floating system on top of that Flax Pond with several tanks in it, several biodiverse systems, and it started cleaning up that pond. And Flax Pond in 2 years was swimmable for the first time in decades. So it's
all right. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Okay.
Yeah, that's a project that really showed me. Now think about this. So the understanding of microbiomes started here. We think now that we used to think that what we ate fed the human, and now we're finding out no, it's better if we're feeding the microbes inside our gut.
Yeah.
And that's stuff that's happened since the 21st century began, that we're starting to realize that we're always evolving a new microbiome depending on what we eat. And what John was doing is showing us, give us a sense of how to build a microbiome. So
all right.
That's a thing. And even go beyond that. What if you wanted to restore an ocean? You build a catamaran, you have 4 big tanks on there, and you put, several ecosystems that are ocean ecosystems, and you apply you go into polluted areas and you start building the microbes that could help heal that system. Maybe you go from a biodiverse area and get all these critters, and then you take them to a less biodiverse area and you seed a healthy shoreline. And that was this idea of ocean arcs, an ocean restorer. And it's the same idea that nature knows how to do this. So that was one time when I thought, well, nature's going to, we're going to survive maybe if we work with nature, that we will have a better chance. But maybe my second most amazing thing that I found was for years I was trying to figure out, how do you graze in Nevada, because it's the driest state in the lower 48. It's the driest state in America. And then I saw this picture. And this is in northeastern Nevada, and they get about 8 or 10 inches of rain a year at most, and it's usually a snow. So they've got a lot of snow in these mountains, and then April and May comes along, and it gashes out these huge gashes in the river. And
that's a river at certain times, huh?
Yeah. This is flash flooding. Within a few weeks, the water would be gone. And Carol Evans out there was working with ranchers for years to try to figure out how to get the grazing right to keep water in these streams longer. and beaver showed up and they don't know where they came from. And that's that picture that you saw before.
Oh,
The
all right.
beaver didn't need wood. They didn't need a forest. I always thought beaver were forest animals, and you had to have wood around. And it turns out they'll start with mud. If there's water, they'll figure out how to stop it. And in fact, once they get it stopped, they'll start building these huge channels underneath, because the ponds have to last all summer long. And you know, so that water that used to come off these hills would stay in the river all summer long. And these gashes here, so in Susie Creek, they've seen 2.5, 3 feet of sediment build up, and it's probably you know, 10 tons of carbon per acre per year. But nobody's studying it, you see.
So say that again. What we're seeing here, this green front thing, that is sequestering carbon. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. And so that if we could do that on a bigger scale, we'd sequester more carbon.
In the United, you know, we've lost probably worldwide 1 billion acres of wetlands, and you know, if we put those wetlands back, that would be a huge chunk of the global warming. But who's good at making wetlands? And of course, so this was the biologist. She's a fish biologist working in Nevada, and she wanted to, you know, and she was working with ranchers to try to help restore the lands, and the beaver showed up. And the ranchers were really concerned, because they say, we've been trying to get this right for years, and now he's going to come mess everything up. and Carol just said, well, why don't we wait and see? And Carol also, we brought Carol to Boston for a Bio for Climate conference. And the first thing she said was, I'm not coming without ranchers. The ranchers have to tell their story too, because they've been working on this for a long time. And I actually have, I think what we ought to do is I ought to stop the share right now. And I can show you a short video of Carol actually doing this.
Oh yeah, okay.
So let's see if it's about 2 minutes, and she's putting a movie together, and they've got a film crew, and just kind of introduce you to Carol Evans.
My name is
Was that a woman? Oh, there's a person. Oh.
Nevada since I became a Bureau of Land Management biologist in 1988. I'm retired now, but I'm still following streams. The streams here have stories to tell. You change the way cows graze on a stream, the plants grow back, and the beaver come in, and that changes everything. That is what happened on Dixie Creek, a little stream near Elko, Nevada. This is Dixie Creek's story. In 1990, the agency I worked for built some fences on Dixie Creek so the grazing could be managed. In other words, over the last 3 decades, cattle could be on some of the area, some of the time, but not all of the area, all of the time. This is Dixie Creek, 30 years later. When the plants grow and the beaver come back, the magic happens. Scientists are starting to think this is how streams here used to look and function before the time of European settlement. There are a lot of ways to manage livestock grazing on streams so the plants come back. And I spent a whole career working with ranchers here in northeastern Nevada doing just that. But this story is about what happens once those plants come back.
Okay.
Beaver need the plants that grow along streams for food and for materials to build their dams. So when managing livestock grazing leads to plants like sedges and rushes and willows coming back, the beavers show up and a dry bed of gravel turns into a magnificent wetland. What could this teach us about what we've lost and what we can find again? What can this teach us about how to heal an ailing planet?
That's wonderful.
In January of 2019, some friends and I set out to tell the story of a recovered Dixie Creek and its beaver over the course of a year. What if people like scientists and sportsmen, like ranchers?
Now, what's really interesting to me about this picture is when the snow melts in the spring now, it used to wash away all this stuff that's trying to grow in the riverbed. And now we've got the willows and the aspens starting to make it through, you know, the flood season. The flood season has just been diminished a great deal. and the water stays on the land longer. And I just thought this is the West used to look like this, and if you have animals that are, you know, they're in the wet meadows at certain times of the year, but they're also moving up, and some of this sagebrush starts changing to perennial grasses. That's kind of their goal, is how to get these animals, you know, the grazing animals farther up the hill, and rehydrating some of this area too. So,
Oh, yeah, okay.
So Jim, perhaps you could say a little bit how the animals are managed and how that affects the land.
well, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
I'll
See,
finish.
I couldn't understand much of what she was saying. I could see the pictures though, and they're sure impressive. The contrast is astounding.
But I think the big thing that she said is maybe this is what the West used to look like. That what Dixie Creek is more. So all the rivers, you know, like when Lewis and Clark went across the country, you know, all the rivers have, you know, we probably had 200 million beaver on the continent, and Canadians got rid of their beaver, and Americans got rid of their beaver, and the British helped get rid of as many beaver as possible because they didn't want Americans going to California. And yeah, so I'll just show another 30
Land
seconds here.
managers, or even people who just like to be outside, could share a common vision of what these streams could be, a place where beaver could thrive and create these magnificent wetlands full of water and wildlife. Every stream has a story to tell, what it once was, what it can be again. How grazing can be managed to get the plants to grow back, which attracts the beaver, and how together those two things can offer hope for a better future.
So what we need are beavers. And now you're saying that that last part of that video, they showed more greenery up on the hills. Is that something that goes with the whole process, or do you expect that?
I would say that's the goal, but most of what I saw was sagebrush and juniper. So it's stuff that's what happens if you get good grazing going on farther up the hills is that the land starts holding more moisture, and the sagebrush starts to die away. Sagebrush can't stand much moisture at all. So it's kind of like you go from and the goal is you want to go from less sagebrush, more perennial grasses.
Now, what makes it hold more moisture up higher?
All that poop.
From what animals?
Well, in Nevada, it used to be pronghorn, and you know, but if you've got cattle, that's what you've got. Let me.
No, but up there, what was she growing there, or was she growing any animals there?
She wasn't raising any animals. She's a biologist. She was just she's been watching the stream for 30 years. She's an incredible field biologist because she stayed in the same area for so long, and she's mostly been working lately to try to figure out how to keep the Lahontan trout viable in the stream. So you have to have streams that are viable. So beaver are really helpful with that. And she's finding freshwater mussels in places that haven't been in years. And this is in the driest state in the country. What excites me about all this is if you can do this in Nevada, you can do it in any state in the country. You can do it in Dakota or West Texas or wherever it's gone dry, because we've taken the grazing animals off the land and put them in feedlots. We've killed off the wild herds. So, you know, getting the wild herds back would be great, but we've got to close the feedlots. That's where the methane problem is with animals. If you can build soil, you know, animals eating grass and building soil is a methane sink. More methane is consumed by that soil than so yeah, I agree.
You know, I have to say, I was just yesterday reading a thing by Drawdown on land use. And some of what they had to say worried me because it didn't fit what I was hoping and what I think I'd read elsewhere, what you just said, in fact. Because what they said is that animals raised in feedlots or fed grain, I don't think they talked about whether they're raised, but obviously if you're going to feed them grain, you're going to have them in feedlots. So the animals in feedlots actually produce less methane in their burps and farts than the animals that eat grass.
I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about they put all the poop into lagoons, and the lagoons go anaerobic and they make methane like crazy. It's the poop that's the problem. The poop needs to go back on the land. I'm not concerned. you know, we've always had animals on the land ever since humans have been on the planet, and they always pooped and they always farted because it's very hard to break down cellulose. But it used to be that you'd build soils that that were, you know, soils have to breathe, you know. So it's like this idea: how do you build a good soil? And this is kind of what Alan Savory, you know, why he's so important. And soils that have enough. A healthy soil has enough gaps in it, you know, enough air spaces that water can flow through it, and air can flow through it, and the mycelium, the fungi can breathe. But also, if you've got methane in the air, it's scrubbed by, you know, that breathing soil will take the methane out. Methane's such a nutrient for microbes that it would just, if we could get the CO2 levels to start dropping, the methane levels would start dropping much faster, because it's such a nutrient for so many microbes.
Wait, say that again. So, it didn't sink in. Would you say?
Getting a good grazing plan on these dry lands all over the world, and getting perennial grasses back on the land, is going to make soils that breathe, that have air spaces. And if these soils breathe, you know, you're going to start seeing, well, one, you're going to see the perennial grasses are pumping CO2, making sugar, pumping it into the ground to feed the microbiome in the ground. But the other side of it is that the methane is such high energy molecule that the microbes that live in the soil are going to consume that like crazy. So if we could ever bend that curve and start getting the CO2 levels to go down, the methane would go down faster.
Okay, now I'm really interested in that notion that there are methane eating microbes. But now I don't think, my impression is that they're kind of not very hardy, and you don't find them just everywhere. They're maybe, you know, my thought was, oh good, let's go sprinkle some microbes around and we'll just take care of everything.
You find that they're aerobic. They run on oxygen. The problem in lagoons is that the microbes in lagoons the water goes anaerobic when you put all that poop in there. And then you've got methanogens. You know, you have methanogens that they're trying to get energy. They don't have any or they're trying to get an electron acceptor. They don't have any oxygen to work with, so they start making methane. You know, that's the micro. This is why studying the microbes is so important. But methanotrophs live in oxygenated soils. Methanogens live in, you know, places that are anaerobic. So, and so we're taking these animals, putting them in feedlots when they ought to be eating grass. We're putting them in feedlots. They still poop, and the poop never gets back to the land. That's the problem, you know. That the way I see it. So that's so here I'm trying to figure out where we are. So I drew this picture about 15 years ago, and I thought somebody at Harvard would be all upset by it or whatever. I believe it a lot more now than I did then. But, you know, a big part of carbon going into the ground is taking all that poop and burying it. And we used to have dung beetles everywhere in the world. And we've killed dung beetles in a lot of ways with pesticides and so forth, but we also use antibiotics on the animals, which hurts the dung beetles. And so
okay.
So we're trying to figure out a genetics so the animals better adapted to the grasslands and the weather and stuff like that. Or buffalo. They usually, I've never heard of antibiotics being used on buffaloes, and trying to get these dung beetles. You say, well, where did dung beetles, you know, you think about every dung ball becomes an ecosystem for dung beetles, and they roll them up in little balls and they bury them. And you know, maybe 2 or 3 feet down. So that I in the 1990s, I thought this was the main source of getting carbon back into the soil. And here's where the dung beetles lived. You know, they didn't live in the permafrost, but they lived everywhere else.
Oh, I see. All the red is the place where they lived. I see.
Yeah. So that was one thing. But then if you go back to my little chart here, on the other side is perennial grasses. The other thing here is this idea of hoof action. What Savory started to notice was the more hoof action there was. Now you want to have a lot of a lot of impact, and then you give the land a chance to recover. So in New England, you might have animals come back once a month. Lots of animals come back once a month, and it recovers. They're there for a couple days, and then they move on, and they come back in the next month. But in West Texas, it might be twice a year. It might be 6 months before you bring the animals back. In Nevada, it might be 2 years. So so it's kind of like the idea of how to get Alan was always saying it's not the number of animals that's important, it's the recovery time, getting the timing right. So that was one thing, was all the poop is important to restore the soils.
And there's no, excuse me, there's no single formula for how quickly you want to bring them back, the animals back, right?
And that's what Alan was good at, and John too, is the idea of be an observer and realize that the intelligence is out there trying to teach you how to manage the land. And
so you look at how much the land is still broken up, or what do you look for if you're going to go look at a piece of soil and say, is it time for me to bring my animals back?
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. Did you get that? But the other thing is, like in some places in West Texas, the ranchers were trying to figure out how to make this happen faster. And they used to have several months a year where they'd have to feed the animals hay because it was just, just too dry or whatever. They didn't have enough forage. So they'd bring hay in, and they thought, we don't want to feed these animals anywhere near the barn or whatever in a central area. We want to take the hay to the worst piece of ground, so that way the animal nutrition will, if you take the hay out to the worst piece of ground, the animals will follow you out there, and they'll poop all over the place, and you'll start having you'll start recovering that system. And
do the animals themselves, they're trampling, does that force the poop into the ground, or does it
that could do some of that, but it's much more if you get the dung beetles there, they're going to bury it. And they're going to bury it pretty fast. But yeah, the hoof action, mostly what that does is that helps restore the water cycle, that the water doesn't just run off. In a lot of places in West Texas now, they haven't had animals in decades, and it's like concrete. There's no organic matter. It's been blown off by sunlight. And they call it caliche because there's so much calcium at the surface. So that's part of why the hoof action is really important when you're trying to get started, and then you want to build the soils. The prairie soils used to be 10 feet deep, 20 feet deep. Here I'll show that.
Yeah.
And so that was another kind of how do you get big blue stem? Here's what we try to grow on the turf grasses we grow on our lawns. You see. Yeah. And that way you're dependent on Scott's chemical company to keep your lawn green or whatever. But big blue and my homeschool students are like, they're really pushing this idea of why don't we have roots anymore in our lawns? And so that's and so anything that these roots can't get to gets to be hard pan, and stuff just runs off, And that's
now these are all perennial grasses, is that right?
These are typical perennial grasses. This was done years ago, and it was in a book by, I think it was in one of the government agencies at one time, and it's been passed around. But the idea, if you've got stuff growing 6 feet high, you might have roots going down even further. You might have roots going down 10 feet. And, so that was just kind of a way, and this is kind of a close-up view. And then what we were finding out in the last few years is that big blue stem makes a lot. It's starting to show up in places where they get their grazing right in the west, and people are saying this must be an invasive species. And then they find out that 100 years ago it was all over. It was all over New Mexico. It was all over, blue stems were all over the West at one time when there were a lot of beaver and there were a lot of, pronghorn and buffalo and so forth. But imagine here, you're making glucose, and about a third of that glucose is made shoots, which is about all we study. We're trying to grow corn that doesn't have any roots because we want to have it all be corn. We want to make grain. But now in a healthy system, maybe a third of the glucose goes into the roots, and then another third goes into the soil microbes. and they actually feed this. This is the third part of the story. Is I have to find a slide here. This is the third part of the story. That healthy ecosystems, healthy plant ecosystems, give a lot of their sugar to the mycorrhizae because the mycorrhizae can go find the minerals. That these lichens are an example of how plants and fungi co-evolved. And now we're starting to think that all plants are dependent on fungi that at some point in their evolution. And trying to feed like corn, all kinds of chemicals and stuff like that, we're losing their ability to get phosphorus from the land, to get calcium from the rocks and stuff like that. And so that's kind of the third part of the story.
This picture you're showing is one little critter. Are those roots all from that one?
This is a little tiny, the beginning of a pine. And 90% of what you see here is the mycorrhizae. It's fungi. It's a mycelium. So it's that. And here's kind of this is Michael Phillips' book. He was a plant guy and he was trying to figure out how to make his apple orchards healthier. And he was trying to figure out how to improve the mycorrhizae. And he came to Chelsea Green Publishers in Vermont and he said, I need a book on the mycorrhizal that I can understand. And they said, well, you're a good writer. Why don't you write it? And he spent 2 years studying the mycorrhizae and then started writing it in a way that an apple orchard guy could understand it. And this is an amazing picture because it shows here's the mycorrhizal network going out. And they have arbuscules. This is called arbuscular fungi. It's going, this is the plant root. And the fungi are going inside and making these.
Going inside those stones or bricks?
Yeah, these bricks are the cells of a plant.
Oh.
The root of a plant.
And they penetrate anything then, huh?
Well, and the other thing is, if they have extra sugars, what the plant is giving sugars to this network, and the network is going out and finding minerals and water for the plant, and it's much easier to do that than to try to grow more roots. It's much easier to feed the mycorrhizae, and this is like this is becoming we're starting to realize this is an incredible exchange system. It's pretty much everywhere. But now here, if you've got some extra sugar that the mycorrhizae don't need right now, the mycorrhizae will store it inside the plant root. So if there's a dry season and the mycorrhizae drop, they die back, they've got something to start with the next cycle, the next time it gets wet. So it's.
So Jim, we just have a few minutes left. I wonder if you would let me show one slide.
Okay. So I have to get off of here then.
Don't go too far because I sure like what you're saying.
Okay.
Go ahead, Phil.
Clearly, we have Jim back, but
no, that's fine.
I believe this chart, I think Alan Savory had this created. It's basically showing very degraded soils around the world. A lot of the very degraded stuff is what humans once managed, but through ignorance, abused to the point where it is no longer fertile. But what Jim and Alan and others are hinting at is that we now know how to bring this back to life. So there's a huge potential around the planet, working with nature and the microbes and the plants and the animals to bring this back from, looking like a desert to being green again.
Oh, beautiful. That is huge. But it looks like one stupendous engineering project. Wow. Who can take that on? I mean, that's
the beaver. I mean, we literally decimated from about 220 million beaver. We're down to around 20 now. But there are restoration projects around the country that are trying to bring them back. For instance, in the Sierra Nevadas, one of the ways to counter the loss of snowpack because of climate change is to ask beaver to go up into the mountains and create ponds at higher elevations with leaky dams so that instead of it all melting, the little snow that we do get, it gets saved and distributed over the course of a summer rather than lost all in the spring.
Well, now you mentioned wetlands, and you've got me convinced that that's an important part of the equation.
Yeah.
I want to get somebody to talk about wetlands, and maybe if you have some tips of people who are specialists on saving wetlands. I guess it's mainly through beavers.
Well, there's a guy that came to one of our conferences a while back, and he started roaming around the West and interviewing people, and he interviewed Carol Evans and some of the others. But he went into Oregon, he went into California, and his name is what's his name, Philip? Goldfarb, I think. We're trying to remember. I've got the book.
Well, if you find his name, send it to me, because I think our time's up, and I probably have to say goodbye now. But
I'll just say at some point where this was leading is I wrote a scenario for how to get the CO2 levels in the atmosphere back to 300 by the time Halley's Comet comes in 2061. My homeschoolers are going to be 60 years old. They were all born right at the millennium. They're born right at the year 2000. And they studied Halley's Comet, and they thought, well, we can see it. And he says, well, yeah, but you're going to be 60 years old. And I thought, what would be really cool is if we instead of spending money on the Defense Department, we had a Civilian Conservation Corps analog for the globe. And this is already starting to happen with Michael Liu's ecosystem restoration camps and so forth. But I wrote that scenario with the idea that nature has the capacity to bring us back to 300 within 40 years, if that's what we chose to do. If we want to go to war with each other, it's not going to work out. But but 300 is doable with what we've got available, if that's what we wanted to do. So we need people to share.
Well, I want to be on your team, boy. We have the same goals, boy. Your figures are amazing. I don't know how many people would agree with you that that's feasible, but I want to believe it, and I'll try.
Well, when John Todd, I was trying to get him to explain it. He says, no, build it. Let nature teach you. Alan Saver, the same thing. Build it. Start moving these animals and getting that poop back out on the land instead of in your feedlots or in your lagoons.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful.
You might get dirty though. It's kind of, it can be a dirty business.
Sounds like it, but I think I'm past the phase of going out and getting my hands in the soil. But I'd be glad to do my best to help people who want to do that. But
what if our kids that we send them into the military and they get all dirty and they do nasty things? What if they were restorers? Like
better dirty than bloody, right?
Yeah, dirty is better than bloody.
That's right. Bless your hearts. You're doing great things, and this is really impressive and wonderful work. I really appreciate this. Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.